Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to show you how I painted bare winter trees with watercolours and ink. Watercolours are really beautiful, especially if you don't labour them too much, but they are famously difficult to use. Please don't get disheartened if your paintings go wrong, because that's all part of learning. The big thing I think that can help is to practice using all the mark making tricks that there are with watercolour painting, and also combining other materials with them as well. You'll see me using some of these techniques in this work in the video coming up, and I hope that you find it interesting. I'll see you later. Okay, I'm going to start off by laying a wash all over this of pure clean water, and then I'm going to start working into the damp paper. This is just getting water all over it, making sure it soaks into the paper thoroughly. The trouble with it drying out a bit too quickly on a recent demonstration. So just making sure I've got plenty of water going on there. I've got a sketch on here that I've done in normal graphite pencil. So I've sketched out the main shapes in the landscape here. But I've also then rubbed them out, rubbed the sketch down so it's not too strong and dark, because it's not water soluble pencil. It's just normal pencil. So I've just lightened it a little bit with a soft putty rubber. But there's enough there to give me a guide of where I need to go. Now the sky is light on here, but there is some blueness in it, so I'm going to start by putting that in and make a blue wash. I think I'll try cobalt blue and get plenty of it. While I'm doing this, the water is soaking into the paper, so we haven't got puddles of water on it when I come to put more colour into this. You want the shine to go off the paper. As you can see at the moment, it's very shiny, glossy looking, where the water is still sitting on the surface, but in a minute or two it will soak in, and then I can work onto it without the colour, the paint sort of flooding all over the place. Gives you a little bit of control, softness but control. I'm hoping cobalt blue will do this, and I'm going to just soften that a little bit with some burnt sienna, which is this one. Just using my guide there, just to take the brightness out of the blue. See how that works. You can test it on a little bit of tissue. That's quite nice. So I think I'll go for it. It is starting to dry. Or shall I? No, perhaps we'll wait for a few minutes. The shine has started to go from the paper now, so I'm going to put on a wash for the sky. Starting at the top, I've got this board propped at a 45-degree angle. Now I just want to make continuous lines across here. So each stripe that I do, get this gutter, this collection of colour here in the gutter where it runs down the page, so you pick that up and take it across, and a bit more. So picking up each time I draw the brush across. I'm going to now water this down a bit because I want it to be a bit lighter down here. Just take watery paint all the way through. Water it down a bit more. This will dry paler than it looks at the moment, and I will also just dab out where I need the light to be on the water. And so there's light over here in the sky. A smaller bit actually. This is just kitchen roll. and that's also casting light onto the water, particularly here. The blue paint, often with blue colours you seem to get this granulation happening, slight speckly quality, which is quite nice, and you can work with that. But just in case you wonder what that is when it happens on your work, it's called flocculation, which is probably one of my favourite words. Anyway, now I've done that, while it's still damp, what I want to do now is suggest the very distant trees on the far bank of the lake. So I'm going to mix up a grey using cobalt blue again, and the burnt sienna again, but keeping it a fairly neutral grey. Probably quite a bit of it actually, I think, to get all the way across there, so I'm going to make up a good puddle. That's good, and I've got a large brush here that I'm going to lay on its side and just take that through the background. I haven't entirely mixed those colours, and I like that when they start to separate when you put them on the work. I don't want this to be too straight because there's all sorts of different heights of trees and different bits of landscape there. I can also sort of roll the brush on its side a little bit to get those tree shapes in the distance. Trying not to fiddle about too much or go back into it. I'm just looking to see if there's anywhere else I want that. Might do that down here too in this landscape, just to kind of fill in where this is in the foreground. Using the brush on its side gives me lots of textures. I'm going to use a bit more of the burnt sienna here, more blue, more burnt sienna, and use this kind of brownish version of the colour for the landscape. This one. Rolling the brush around to suggest all these scrubby plants here. And I like where the brush misses a little bit. When you do this, you get kind of these nice textures. And what I've also got here is I picked up some sticks in the garden that I'm going to draw with in the ink later too, but I'm going to use them for these reeds. So there's grasses growing around the edge of the lake here. So I'm just scratching into the wet paper with the rough edge of the stick, and it's drawing the paint to it. The paint blots to the rough edges of the scratches, and it's giving me a fine mark that goes right along here too. And there's a few of those in here as well, which are bigger. And if I add more layers of paint, that will also get drawn to these scratches too. They kind of blot the colour to them, these scratched lines. It gets really dark down in this area, so I probably will need to layer more paint on, I think. Okay. Just thinking about what to do next. So I think I will let that dry for a moment. Okay, you can see now that this is softening at the back here, which is really nice because that's creating the sense of distant trees there. What I want to do now, before this dries completely, is to get some really dark, neutral kind of tones in here, and start to draw the trees in too, I think, while that's still wet. So I'm going to darken all of this. Could use the same colours again, I think. Just more of them. This is a large goat hair brush, Chinese brush, which I really like. It gives such lovely marks. Probably not the best paintbrush for mixing colours. They seem to all soak into the brush so quickly. But I want them to come out of the brush slightly separated too, so doing it this way makes sense. So I've got the Chinese brush loaded up with this blue-brown mix, sort of blue and burnt sienna. Oh, cobalt blue and burnt sienna. Needs to be darker still, actually. This is drying really light. So I've got a pile on the colour a bit. That's better. Because it's also going onto damp paper, so that's diluting it further. That's better. And this also comes down into the water. And this brush I can drag on its side. It's like it was made for landscape painting because it's just gives you wonderful textures. But a large round brush used in this way will be good too. I won't take it back there because I don't want that to go dark. And I'll bring this into the foreground too. Let's get some more paint. So just cobalt blue and burnt sienna again, and plenty of both. And then I'm just looking at this picture, squinting through one eye and trying to simplify the shape of it, making sure I get the shape of the landscape and these grasses in relation to the water right. And that gets quite dark in here. And the tree reflections come right down, but there are little gaps where the water's reflecting the sky too. Bring that down here. And I want to get a little bit more burnt sienna into the foreground, I think. And that will help to bring it forwards and suggest those brown twiggy plants there. And I'm going to use the scratchy twig again to draw this up through too. Because I don't want hard shapes in the foreground here, I want these to be twiggy, grassy shapes. And then just build this up a little bit in the foreground. You can also kind of suggest the plants by turning the brush around, sort of printing with the side of it here. And then just want to go a little bit darker on these grasses because they're dark against the light water. Sort of pile it on a little bit. Just dabbing it around. And a bit more scratching because it's going darker where the scratches are. Try not to get too into a habit of doing this. It's much more random in reality, so it's quite easy for your hand to get into a rhythm of making marks that isn't as irregular as it is in nature, and obviously it makes it much more interesting the more irregular your marks are. Kind of creates interesting stuff to look at when you do this. Okay, I want to tackle the trees next. I think I'll just check. I'm just tilting this to see how dry that is. I think that's really quite dry up there. So I'm going to put the trees in a little bit of that paint that's on the brush from this foreground, and then I'm going to work into them with ink too. Just want to suggest where they need to go, not too strong. The danger is when you draw, if I just drew the trees on with the ink, it would look a bit stuck on and a bit flat. So I'm hoping that this will help just to kind of make them look a little bit painted too. Get a finer brush. There's all kinds of bushy things here too. Right, I've got two sorts of ink. One is old-fashioned Quink, which is water soluble, and the other is a water resistant one from Winsor & Newton, a drawing ink. And I think I'm going to go with the water soluble one. There's not much of it, but I think I can do this. There's enough there to do this. And I've sharpened a twig from the garden into a sort of flat point. But I like the randomness you can get with drawing with a twig, so I'm just going to dip the twig into the ink and then draw these trees in onto this slightly damp paper, and I want to kind of get random looking marks. You have to sort of experiment a little bit. I can sort of draw these out to sort of put the blob on and then work with it. And printing it on, scratching away. So they don't have to be terribly accurate, just capture the nature of what's there. And the trunks are obviously the bit that's most visible. I'm getting sort of random thick and thin lines here. It's quite nice if you get a pile of ink in the centre of the trunk, you can then draw it out with the twig, and as it dries the lines become more faint, which helps to describe how thin the twigs are here. This is way above the horizon line. The tops of these trees are above that back horizon line. I like the way this one is kind of leaning over. Big thing with trees is to remember that there are three-dimensional. There's branches coming towards us with twigs on, as well as going away. So, you know, don't just have the twigs on the outside edge of your tree. This one's got ivy all over it. It's a bit random how it picks up the ink, but that's kind of part of the charm of this. The big thing with trees is to try and get some character into them. They are all unique and they are shaped by the environment and how they're placed in relation to other trees, and these have got some lovely sweeping shapes to them. Just dab that a little bit. It's a bit like felt tip pen, but just a little bit drier and less predictable, varied marks. There's also a lot of stuff going on under the trees too, which is just as dark. And here. The other way of doing this, I'll show you another method because it's probably worth trying that too, is to just get a clean twig. That one. You can put on a really strong colour. I'm going to put on some sepia from this paint set, which is basically a very dark blackish brown. I can make it nice and strong, almost inky. I'll show you how that can work. So these trees have got, I'm going to put a bit on there actually, but these trees have got ivy, so they've got thick trunks where the ivy is, and then it goes up into the branches and they become thin. There's another one here growing up. So what I can do, having blobbed the ink on, is use a clean twig and just draw the ink, the paint up away from that blob of trunk and scratch into it. Might be able to wet it a little bit more. Darken that too there. In fact, I can dip a twig in. Oh, that's not working so well. If you've got a decent puddle. There we go. Oh, no, don't want that. Okay. I'll carry on with the stick. Thin stick. It's a little bit wet there, but I may as well work on it and see what happens. I keep looking at the photograph. It's very easy to think you know what these look like, but it's well worth checking that you're not going too far away from what's there. I want to get some textures in down here too. There's a lot of bushes growing down here. It's a nice sort of sweep across the landscape here too. This one is quite dark and thick, so I'll build that up a bit more. Also, these have shadows down here, which I think I could put those into. Not shadows, reflections, sorry. I'm just laying the twig on its side, getting some textures in there. I think what I'd like to do now is just suggest some twigs with the paintbrush. Wherever it's gone, this one. Small paintbrush, I'm going to darken the sepia with some cobalt blue. Just make it a little bit less warm, just cool it down a little bit. Just check that there, make it slightly more watery. Just checking it, and then I'm going to use that to just roll around where the twigs are, little dabs. And that kind of suggests clouds, almost clouds of twigs. Where they're bushier, there's where they overlay each other. You get a sort of bunch of twigs. So dab that so it's not too solid. Kind of helps to join up all those branches too. And go down into the landscape a bit too. Just darken that a little bit. So use more of the sepia and cobalt blue. To draw it down into the water. Across the landscape, so you get, going vertically, you get a sense of the reflections on the water. There's not much more to do really. I'm just wondering, I think I might darken the foreground a little bit more. Use this round brush, I think, and just get a little bit more intense. I want some stronger colour in there because that's now very dark. I need to go darker in the foreground too. Try more of the sepia and some burnt sienna. Don't want to cover up everything that's underneath. I quite like seeing one bit of paint under another. Just drag it up so I haven't got solid patches of paint. Just stand up and have a look at that. I could add a little bit more there. I think that could be bigger. So I'm going to go back to my cobalt blue and sienna mix, burnt sienna. Just make that a little bit more pronounced. Because it's such a strong dark feature of the foreground, this grass that grows along here. I'll scratch into that too. Some darker lines in here too. Oops. So just drag some of that sepia colour, which is this one, across the foreground again, just where I've scratched it again. Amazing how that the side of the brush gives this grassy feel, this movement. going to stop there. I think less is more. You can see here where the pale colour of the distant trees now has sort of merged in with the sky and the back of the lake, almost suggesting reflections too, and that's really just painted itself. I've put the paint on there, let it do its thing and left it alone, and that's creating a nice misty distant effect over there. So I think that's quite effective. I'll stop there now. Okay, I hope you found that interesting. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.